Yeah, I'm Tezza from Nova News. I'm here with Sue Hubbard, who is what we would call in North a famous person. And
You mean I have to come up north to be famous?
yeah. Up north, if you're from London and you do poetry, you're famous.
Okay, well, I'll accept being famous in north. Okay.
Right. I do understand that. So just to make it clear, we're actually at Normanby Hall for the 2023 No Limits Festival. And Sue Hubbard has obviously kindly given us a bit of her time because she is a poet, and we find it encouraging from people who have managed to make a living out of this, not just do it as a hobby, to encourage other people. And I understand you're obviously not just a poet, you're a novelist, and you've released a book recently. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, well, lots of things. I don't think even if you're a professional poet, I've published 6 books with my new one just out. Make money from being poets. But so I think we can knock that one on the head. But yes, I'm here kindly because Rabbit Hole Bookshop asked me, because I've just published a new novel called Flatlands, which is set in the Fens. Further down on the wash between Peter Scott's lighthouse on the edge of the River Nene and King's Lynn, and it's very loosely, very, very loosely based on Paul Gallico's children's story, The Snow Goose. So Nick, who owns Rabbit Hole Bookshop, read it and loved it and said, I think it would be fabulous to have a book about the Fens. So although this has gone great guns last year being a children's festival, I'm sort of like the oddball really, because it's not really yet established as an adult festival, but that's what I'm doing here. And to get to your question, yes, I am a poet, but I'm not a spoken word poet.
Yeah.
And I'm very much, it sounds so highfalutin and pretentious to say a literary poet, but I'm a page poet. I do perform I don't perform my poetry. I read my poetry. It's not performance. And of course, if you're a spoken word poet, performance is so much part of it. I suppose it's a bit like the difference between, heavy metal and folk, or Vivaldi and rock music. It's all music,
Sure.
and all with our own audience, but different, I suppose.
Well, it's interesting because I've obviously, like many people have, I've seen some of the moments with videos online where I've seen you speak some of your poetry. And as an actor, I resonate with that emotional connection. And I find that there's a real irony, because the irony is that a lot of people, and it seems unrelated, but it's not, that a lot of people who think that they want to be performers, that they think that sometimes they can't, they're not suited to it, because they feel that that there might be a fear involved or a sensitivity. And quite often, certainly from my point of view, that sensitivity is what makes me able to act, because people get to resonate with the emotions. It's like right now, you can probably tell that I'm feeling something. So even just the moment of feeling something is a lot of people that makes them uncomfortable. And I know that I have to be comfortable with the uncomfortable to do the job. And when I've heard you do your poems, I've seen that what I might call a human vulnerability that actually brings it to life. So there's an irony here. How do you feel about that?
I suppose that for me, it's all in the writing. And yes, I suppose I'm a practiced reader. I'm also a broadcaster, so I'm not too fazed about speaking. And actually, for me, the vulnerability is not in the performance. The vulnerability is in the writing, exposing myself in the writing. And it is the writing that matters. And if I can convey that through the reading. Whereas I think for spoken word poets, certainly the best ones that I've seen, the performance is absolutely intrinsic to the material. well, that's not true of me. I could never perform it and the books would exist in the world. But I do like reading, and I, I, I like reading when there's an audience who I know really engage. And it's much harder to listen to literary poetry because it's not such fun. I mean, a lot of spoken word stuff is catchy and fun and, rappy and exciting, and people have a good time. You, but with page poetry, you have to listen. So
Right, there is one thing that I mentioned to people who go to the spoken word event. Sometimes they read parts of a novel. And what I say to some of the people is that some things have been written to have in your head. They're not written. So if, like, for example, we look at Shakespeare, it's clearly written to be said because it's the shape of the words, the sound of the words, how those words activate through the human body, the whole holistic physical experience and psychological, the intellect, everything all into one. And when somebody reads some poems and when somebody reads some novels, I would argue actually that it's not been written to be out loud.
I agree and I don't agree. I mean, yesterday I was reading from my novel Flatlands, which is Get a Little Plug, published by Pushkin Press, just out. And that's why I was invited here, because it's set in the Fens. Now, I totally agree. It's much harder to read bits of a novel than it is to read a poem, because a poem has a beginning and an end, and you can read it in a minute or 2 minutes. But I actually think after all, we have audiobooks, and I do think it really matters how you read prose. It's no good if you just come in and put your head down and you don't know once upon a dead you have to, if you're an actor, you know that if you're reading prose, what matters as much as anything are the pauses and the silences for people to take it in, and you have to read slowly and expressively, but not dramatically, as if it were an audiobook, as if people were actually listening on a headphone or something. But it's not as, I don't think reading literary poetry, I hate using this word literary all the time because it sounds sort of snotty, but it's what it's called, literary fiction. And I think it's harder to read that. As I say, I've run poetry gigs in London. I used to do that. And, we had open mic slots and, we had some brilliant performers, but they were performing poets. The performance, you haven't got that if you're reading a quiet, reflective poem. Sure. You just have to, it's the language has to carry it. I don't want to put myself in the same league as Shakespeare. That would be a bit too much. But in the way that as an actor, you have to let the words of Shakespeare resonate. Well, I think that's what one tries on a much more modest scale to do in the sort of thing I write.
Well, with a lot of poetry that I've read from various writers, some of it I read, and it kind of gets a little bit heady. And other stuff like actors would say with scripts, some of it just comes straight off the page. And I've got to be honest, when there's lots of irony involved here, I believe, because when I've seen your little videos where you've read your poetry, it's definitely got that kind of like organic life to it that lifts off the page and seems written to be spoken out loud.
Well, it isn't written to be spoken, but what I'm very glad you're saying that it's organic, because I'm not interested in poetry that tries to show off intellectually. I'm actually interested in very deep and complex things, but I want it hidden in the everyday. And I think if I can be a bit Ing-lit for the moment and quote the great American poet William Carlos Williams, he said, "No ideas but in things." And that is so true. I may want to talk about memory, and I see a pair of glasses sitting there. And if I can get that right, then that will conjure the memory. I don't need to go into a whole philosophical what's it about memory. So, also I'm an art critic, so things
Sure.
and objects in that painterly way are really important to me. And I think, again, that's one of the differences. The immediacy of spoken word is to immediately connect with the audience and make them have a good time and make them think as well. I'm, political, but it's very different. My poetry is much more ruminative, much more meditative, much quieter, but it is very based in the real world. So I'm very glad you used the word organic.
Well, yeah, I definitely think all organic fits it. And whilst I'm the kind of person, despite what I'm doing here today with Sue, I'm not the kind of person that has that talent of remembering all detail of titles of things and everything else. But Flatlands, you mentioned Flatlands. I know that you read a little bit of that on one of your videos. And I instantly, as an actor, it's like I wanted to have it for breakfast, dinner, and tea. You know,
Oh,
it was
thank you, yeah.
like they're really nice. And I even printed out one of your. I believe it's a recent poem of
Oh,
yours.
you want me to? Do you want me
Oh,
to
well,
read
that would be absolutely delightful if you'd be comfortable with that.
This is the first. I'm going to read it from the book. because I
Okay,
have
the
it
fine.
here. Wait. Oh no, it's over there. Thank you so much.
It's
Thank
fine.
you. Might as well read it from the book.
Sure.
That I'm glad you like that poem because it's the first one of this collection, which is called Swimming to Albania.
Yeah.
By a delightful Irish press, and I love being published by them because, of course, in Ireland more than here.
I used to live there, by the way.
Oh, fantastic! Well, then you'll know the respect that they have for poetry. And although I've published 2 collections since, one that formed an exhibition with a Royal Academician Female Artist and Women's Art Collection in Cambridge on the life of Marie Curie called Radium Dreams. And my newest one, which isn't even actually out yet, which is on the life of Gwen John, God's Little Artist. That's a different publisher. But this is the last one of my poem, the last collection of my poems. So as you pull that one out, and as it's short, I will read it. And
That's lovely, thank you.
it is the very first one of this collection, and it actually says a lot about the collection. Lost in space. There are galaxies inside me, interstellar stars and dust. I'm full of dark matter, quarks and spirals of deep love that cannot be seen with the naked eye, lives that might have been different under other alignments. Somewhere amid black holes and the absorption of light beyond the mass of Milky Way, there's a distant room, the walls covered with faded flowers, a meadow of flecked sunlight where a child lies beneath a bleached quilt in a narrow bed, dreaming of a boat with a single blue sail, a boat that will take her home.
That's beautiful, sir.
Thank
And
you.
what is nice is that, when people sometimes interviewing someone and somebody does something and they say, "Oh, that was wonderful, thank you very much." What is really nice is because I choose things based on what connects with me, and I'm not interested in doing things that don't connect with me. And what, for me, when I read this, you could argue whether it was the intention of the author or not. But what happened for me is this paradox. Paradox is one of my favourite words, by the way. This,
Good word.
right,
Good word.
absolutely. So this paradoxical thing for me is that this idea of this vast universe and the liberating freedom and everything else, but also utterly terrifying.
Absolutely.
Absolutely terrifying. Lost and found at the same time.
Well, Rilke talks about beauty being terrifying. So, I mean, one of the great poets of these paradoxes, actually. But I'm really glad you liked that poem, because actually it signifies the sort of mood of the collection. And I talked about memory, and of course that is totally about memory, but I never mentioned that. And it is the memory of the childhood bed, the wallpaper, all those things that we all have, from 6, 7, 8, when we're just becoming aware of the world, and you might not be asleep when you're looking at the wallpaper or whatever it is.
I like the contrast, or some people might use that fancy word, juxtaposition or something. But I like also how it sweeps from that vast universe to that cramped room with a small bed, and then the child imagining the sailboats with the blue flag. And what is interesting about this, I've read this once. Yeah, I've read it once, it's not difficult for me to remember.
Good.
The vital ingredients.
Well, it's lovely that you like it. I mean, we'll flag up the collection yet again. We do the advertising PR, because nobody else does it for poets. But actually, the fact that ends with home, the last poem in the collection is about a sense of looking for a home in a very adult sense. I mean, it's a very, use a cliched idea to talk about journeys, but this is a journey. It's life's journey about how we define who we are and the self and what we look for in a way. And it's a meandering and wandering of looking for that through all sorts of different places, and some of them European cities, some of them, but it's always looking for that lost thing that I think any creative person is aware of. That's perhaps why we make stuff, why one's an actor or a painter or a poet or whatever. There's some lost thing that we can't quite name. And I think that that's what this book's really about. And that's the introduction to it. So,
well, that word again, beautiful.
Thank you.
Absolutely beautiful. And just on reflection of that, you mentioned about how you'd be as a person and an artist. So I would use the term artist because it encompasses all the things that you do.
Well, I think I'm very lucky and very stupid as well, that I have 3 disciplines, and which is that I'm a poet. I mean, I've published 6 collections now, and I'm up here doing my 4th novel, but I'm also an art critic. I used to be an art critic on The Independent. I write for a lot of art blogs and artist catalogues. But looking at art, that thing of looking, it really helps when you're a poet. Go back to old Carlos, no ideas and things. By looking, you find images to express what you want to say, I think. And so they all feed into one another, but it's not a sensible thing to do. You should really stick with one thing and try and make that work. But trying to do 3 is a bit nutty, but there you go, that's what I do.
But a piece of abstract art communicates in a particular way that somebody writing something sometimes can't. But they can inspire each other as well, do you think?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, obviously, art is a non-linguistic way of expressing many of the things that we're talking about. But the concerns that it depends. There are as many types of art as there are poets or writers. It's like lots of ways to cook an egg. But the artists that personally interest me are the ones that are asking the big questions in the way that I am. And so that doesn't necessarily make me a populist or popular, but I am interested in the big questions, and so are they, and so are the poets and writers that I like to read. So,
well, Mrs. Brown's Boys, or Mrs. Brown Boy? It's Mrs. Brown's Boys. I know this seems irrelevant, but Mrs. Brown's Boys is extremely popular. But so popular is, to me, is like.
Well, I would give that a wide berth. Sorry, whoever is the producer and director.
I would give it a wide berth as well.
Despite the fact that I have a long and loving connection with Ireland, but my connection with Ireland is rather more to do with Seamus Heaney and James Joyce and the beautiful landscape. So I think the thing is, okay, you know, before we wrap it up, that I would say that one of the things, to use your word, and maybe you didn't, but I'll use it, there's a dichotomy with contemporary poetry. There's a great desire, right from the Poetry Society and publishers, to make it popular, because otherwise it doesn't sell books and it's impossible for them. And also to make it more democratic, so that you know, people who have not necessarily been brought up reading books and things feel they have a voice. And I wouldn't want anybody to feel excluded from having anything to say. That's totally justifiable. But I think the fact is that poetry, in the sense that I am writing it, is always going to be difficult and slightly elitist. I mean, because one's dealing with difficult things. And that's why I make the division between, you know, performance and spoken word, which is great, because then everybody does feel they have a voice. I mean, I totally support that. But it is different from the sort of poetry that I and many other, you know, much more famous and wonderful poets than me, because it's dealing with difficult things, and it's dealing with language, and it's dealing with the elasticity of language and how you can play with language. And that's not easy, and it never will be easy. So I think, you know, if I was dictator of the poetry universe, I would stop trying to, you know, popularize literary poetry. Make it available to anybody that wants to come in. I'm not talking about putting up barriers, but just to acknowledge, you know, that running takes all sorts of forms. You can jog, you can sprint, you can do a marathon. It's all running and it's all valid, but they are slightly different. And I think it would be, and there's no reason why one shouldn't cross between them. But I think probably for the best of reasons, because we want to be inclusive and democratic, we sort of fudge it all together like, you know, Play-Doh. And I don't think that necessarily helps anybody, but that's my opinion.
Well, the one area that I relate with that is Shakespeare. And you may have noticed that, like, whilst, like, I went to the Stratford-upon-Avon a couple of weeks back and watched Macbeth at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and like, obviously that works because it's a tourist location as well, and so it's making what is normally regarded as a little bit inaccessible accessible, because it has a tourist twist to it, which makes it useful, you could argue. But I do feel like 'cause I do actor workshops each week, that when I bring Shakespeare out to introduce that little bit, people get a little bit frightened and reserved and think you've got to be intellectual.
It's the same with poetry. But I think the thing is, this is a much wider conversation we don't have time to have, but poetry needn't be frightening, Shakespeare needn't be frightening, but then people have to be introduced to it in school in a way that realise, yes, you have to put a bit of effort in, you know, it's not like listening to a rapper, but once you begin to get your ear in and your imagination in, you can understand it. Even if you don't understand every word, you can understand the conveyed. But I don't think everything should be immediately easy. You know, I think good things require a bit of effort.
I agree. The challenge, it makes you deep dive a little bit more. But the thing is, when I was a child at school, Shakespeare was taught more academically, and not with the word we used earlier, organically, where it's been specifically written to be performed, and in the iambic pentameter to have a rhythm, probably to help the actors to learn the lines as well. But I think that kind of like ties things up in a way with this kind of relationship between the written word and the spoken word, that as an actor I can see that
Well,
that
exactly. Of
difficult
course.
area.
I mean, you can spend a career writing academic books on Shakespeare, and well worth doing, because they're so complex in ways that even the best actor won't bring out, but then a great performance of Shakespeare is just a miraculous thing, So, I mean, but then we're talking about Shakespeare, probably the world's greatest writer that you can almost do anything with. I've seen punk versions of Shakespeare. You can do anything with Shakespeare almost. It is resilient, because he is just such a wonderful poet and such a wonderful playwright. But I would just come back finally to this, that for me, moved a long way from what I'm doing here, but for me, Shakespeare is ultimately about language, and that's what interests me. Language, really. Language, about using language about in a way to paint the world, really. So that's what I do. I use words to paint the world.
And I think that fits really, really well with your relationship with art, because I don't want to keep you too long today, but I do know that you did some work which was like a collaboration with an artist.
Well, my last book but one was in collaboration, the poems of Marie Curie that were shown in the Women's Art Collection in Cambridge, which used to be New Hall, is now Murray Edwards College. And she's an academician. I've known her for many years. And I started writing these poems of Marie Curie. Well, I've probably got the book here somewhere I can show you. She did wonderful illustration. And this is the sort of thing that I really like doing. So that's her illustration. And we have wonderful images throughout of. So that was shown, the poems in the gallery and the painting. And then the one I've just done, which I won't get out of my bag, is on the life of the painter Gwen John. So yes, art and literature, they're my two things. And
so it's all a means of artistic expression, obviously. Okay, well, I've just got one thing to ask. I understand that you used to sell jewellery in the 18th and 19th century. Is that correct? I didn't realise you'd been around that long, sir.
That's going back into another life.
That's the tongue-in-cheek bit, by the way.
Well,
I mean, when I said you used to sell it in the 18th and 19th century, I knew that it was 18th and 19th century jewellery.
Well, I used to have a stall in Portobello Road. Well, I brought my 3 children up on my own. We left the country and came to London. And I had serendipitously, when I was about 18, had a proper training in antique jewellery. And that's how I kept us. And it allowed me to begin to write. It was not easy. People think, oh, I've published all these books. I brought 3 children up on my own and ran an antique business. And I was up 3-4 mornings a week at 5:30. So, but it did allow me time to pick the kids up from school and to write some of the rest of the time. I wasn't clocking into a job. So yes, I do know a lot about that, and probably it would have been much more profitable to stay doing that than be a poet.
Well, acting's not often profitable either. But this is Sue Hubbard that I've just been speaking to just now. Poet, art critic, novelist, broadcaster, and all round lovely person.
Oh,
and that's and everybody will know when they see this on camera. They will know that that's an authentic reaction, and not just for the camera. And it's been absolutely lovely, Sue. It's so lovely. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.